started to learn about Upadhyaya, I was struck by the level of interest he showed in issues of political economy and his serious attempts to outline an alternative economic policy for India. The level of surprise was increased by the observation that a number of his ideas, although not by any means the dominant thrust of policy, nonetheless seem to find expression today. In the context of the regnant confusion about how economic policy is made in India today, I am suggesting that the Upadhyaya line of thinking provides a repertoire of ideas from which the ruling party, sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously, draws selectively upon. But the support base that this line of thought represents exists in an uneasy alliance with other groups that point to future tensions that the further revival of Upadhyaya might exacerbate. Deendayal Upadhaya has been recalled to life. Since it took office over 5 years ago, the BJP has made concerted attempts to revive the memory of this late founder and erstwhile General Secretary of its predecessor, Bharatiya Janata Sangh. On the 99th anniversary of his birth, 25th September 2015, the Nehru Memorial Library opened an exhibition titled Pandit Deendayal Upadhyaya, A Life of Dedication. The final slide of the exhibition ended with the following, and the typos were there, and I'll quote directly. His life, ideas, and work lives on in India of the present. His influence on the future of Indian politics remains very significant. Unquote. A signature rural electrification scheme announced the same year was the 75,600 crore Deendayal Upadhyaya Gram Jyoti Yojana. And to commemorate his centennial birth anniversary 1 year later, the Prime Minister released 15 volumes of the complete works of Deendayal Upadhyaya. Upadhyaya never enjoyed this status before and remains a largely mysterious figure. During his lifetime, when Nehru's Congress dominated Indian electoral politics, he was known mainly in the north of India. But today, it is Upadhyaya's integral humanism that the BJP professes to be its philosophy, and their aim is to elevate him to the status of a national icon. Recently, the photograph of India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, hanging in the main seminar room of the Nehru Library, was replaced by that of Upadhyaya's. However, an ensuing outcry saw it return to its original position. The Prime Minister now lives on Lok Kalyan Marg. Lok Kalyan is Upadhyaya's term for the ideal motive for individual action. We do have some basic biographical information about Upadhyaya. He was born in 1916 in a village in Rajputana to a Brahmin family. Orphaned at the age of 7, he was raised by his maternal uncle. As an undergraduate in Kanpur, he joined the RSS and subsequently became a full-time organizer. In 1947, he founded the Rashtradharm Prakashan in Lucknow, from which he brought out daily, weekly, and monthly periodicals, the most famous of which still in existence today is Panchajanya. He was influential in establishing the Uttar Pradesh wing of the Janata Sangh and took over the party after Shyama Prasad Mukherjee's death in 1953. And more than anyone until L.K. Advani and Atal Bihari Vajpayee, he was responsible for bringing Hindu nationalism into mainstream electoral politics. Upadhyaya's Janata Sangh, which existed from 1951 to 1977, was a party of chiefly Hindu traders, small industrialists, and clerical workers. It was prominent in chiefly Hindi-speaking areas where its parent RSS had its largest number of supporters. Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Bihar, Delhi, but also the Punjab. In the 1967 general elections, the year before Upadhyaya died, it won 35 seats in the Lok Sabha with a 9.4% share of the vote. Not substantial, but not negligible either. Scholars of Hindu nationalism have by and large neglected to tackle how under Deendayal Upadhyaya, the Hindu nationalist right developed an economic agenda that endured. The word Vikas dominates political discourse today. But what if the developmental imaginary differs from that with which we are familiar? In this talk, I seek to revise the view that Hindu nationalist politics has never been associated with a clear economic agenda until recent times, or that it has shape-shifted based on political expediency, as recent scholarship has contended. Rather, the ascent of Hindu nationalism in India has been driven ideologically not merely by cultural nationalism, but also an alternative set of economic ideas tracing back to Hindu nationalist party politics in the late 1950s. The first part of this talk anchors Upadhyaya's ideas against the backdrop of Indian developmental planning in the 1950s. While planners implemented a mixed economy model inspired by the interwar heavy industry-led development of the Soviets, I locate Upadhyaya in an alternative genealogy of Indian economic thinkers inspired by Japanese development. Next, I read closely together Upadhyaya's Hindi and English books produced in the year 1958, a year of trouble during the second five-year plan, to show how Upadhyaya's proposal for Arthniti ka Bharatiyakaran, or Indianization of economics, broadly translated, reconciled Hindu nationalist commitments of strengthening the nation and expelling foreign influence to a small, industry-led, decentralized, and labor-intensive process of industrialization. A brief final section considers the appearance of aspects of these ideas in subsequent incarnations of Hindu nationalist thought and practice before examining the last 5 years of policy. So, I'll begin by discussing the dominant policy atmosphere in which Upadhyaya operated. From about 1950, planning became the cornerstone of Indian economic policy. For the next 15 years, it formed a key part of the Congress's project for transforming India. The centerpieces of these efforts were large-scale dams and massive steel plants, which Nehru famously referred to as the new temples of India. India's planners envisioned the process as both a well-phased and a democratic exercise. They made publicity efforts to co-opt the public into participating in planning and raising consciousness of the project. It was accompanied by a rhetoric of socialism. Managed by experts sitting on a planning commission, the project drew distinguished visitors from across the world as consultants. The statistician Prasanta Chandra Mahalanobis, who had recreated India as a set of numbers through instituting large-scale national sample surveys and sought to raise these numbers for good, gave this project its theoretical shape. This was a quasi-scientific exercise involving sophisticated models, and it was big. The large scale was an important part of the aesthetic as well as the materiality of planning. It was a pillar of Nehru's modernist vision for the nation. Practically, Indian planning was an exercise in import substituting industrialization. Investment was focused into capital goods producing heavy industries owned by the state. Other industries were owned either privately or by both private and public actors. This is known as the mixed economy, and the pursuit of this mixed strategy required Indians to repress consumption or consume substandard Indian goods to generate the necessary savings rate required for capital investment in heavy industry. The second five-year plan, which ran from 1956 to 61, it was the major planning effort undertaken by the country, was informed by the understanding that it was the shortage of capital goods that created the major bottleneck against rapid economic growth. It was believed that investing in the capital goods sector would generate its own demand for consumption goods, the production of which would subsequently expand. Excess labor in the form of disguised unemployed workers in agricultural professions would take up employment in these capital goods industries. Despite short-term sacrifice, the domestic consumption goods sector would grow more rapidly in the long run. This model drew inspiration from Soviet industrialization and planning, which had commenced in the late 1920s. Although Indian planning was tied to an objective of self-sufficiency from outside markets, it had institutional, ideological, and material connections to the outside world. The second plan relied on deficit financing of about 8%, met from countries abroad. While the plans focused on generating heavy industrial output, the country found itself unable to produce enough food to feed its citizens. And the United States became a major exporter of food to India with the PL480 program. In another area where the plan did not prioritize investment, that of village and community development, organizations like the Ford Foundation were invited to contribute their expertise in capital. Technical assistance of various sorts was forthcoming from countries like the Soviet Union and West Germany. Rather than the Soviets, it was the Japanese experience of development from the Meiji Restoration in 1868 until the end of the First World War that served as one of the founts of inspiration for Upadhyaya's thinking around economic development. The objective of the Meijis was Fukoku Kyohei, or rich country, strong military. Industrialization combined with militarization and a heavy dose of nationalism in these years marked Japan out as an example for the Asian world to behold and admire. The Meijis invested resources in education, and schools imparted national training that built nationalist sentiment. Military conscription supplied the army with troops to fight successful wars against China, Korea, and Russia. Japanese industrialization before 1919 differed from the later Soviet experience in three ways that I'd like to highlight. First, it was driven by private rather than public enterprises in its initial stages. The state merely helped ensure a favorable environment for business. Dimensions of this assistance included a banking act that spurred the rise of small banks supplying credit to enterprise, import substitution in the cotton industry, policies of preferential buying and technical and financial assistance to domestic businesses. Major infrastructural investment by the state in railways and shipping connected markets and allowed goods and people to move more freely. And the dissemination of foreign technology by the government allowed Japanese industries to adopt improved methods in production. After treaties restrictions imposed in the second half of the 19th century by America and other Western powers expired in 1910, the Japanese state instituted protective tariffs to support private industry. Bureaucrats assisted private sector enterprises in the pursuit of national goals. The second delineating factor was that light industry, or consumer goods industries, had provided the thrust behind early Japanese industrialization. Cotton and silk industries led the charge. Small firms set up by traders, wholesalers, and local entrepreneurs were vibrant. And by and large, these firms used labor-intensive methods of production. They tended to produce Japanese foods and household goods that did not have ready Western substitutes. Despite the influx of Western goods, Visvesvaraya had visited Japan twice and observed it carefully over a period of 20 years. He believed that Japan could be an inspiration for India. As in his princely Mysore, the Japanese sovereign, the Meiji Emperor, had empowered ministers with wide discretionary authority to manage the process of bringing about rapid industrialization and provided protective tariffs against foreign imports. Visvesvaraya believed that private capital should be the engine for industrialization, and the state should only become involved where private capital was not forthcoming. And although he is typically known for his work on big dams and irrigation projects, and we celebrated Engineers Day last Sunday to mark his birth anniversary, in his books, he paid specific attention to the importance of small industries using simple machines in the development of Japan, where they comprised over 50% of firms. C. N. Vakil had also familiarized himself with Japan's economic organization and written extensively on this matter. He suggested to the Planning Commission in 1955 that the Japanese rather than the Soviet model was more appropriate for the second five-year plan, observing that, quote, the Japanese experience, which concentrated on manufacture of low-cost capital equipment of various types, is preferable to that of the Soviet Union, unquote. And he urged that, quote, a close study of the Japanese experience is essential, quote. Instead of a capital goods-led model of development, he advanced a wage goods model of development. Whereas the Mahalanobis strategy assumed that labor supply was equivalent to employable units of labor, and that the bottleneck to increasing productive employment was machinery, Vakil contended that in less developed countries, it was the availability of wage goods, consumption goods such as food and cloth, for consumption by workers that was the bottleneck. Therefore, the idea that investment would automatically pull excess workers into the investment/capital goods sector from the wage goods sector was flawed. In his mind, the logic worked the other way around. The development strategy he proposed was that it was one in which savings were mobilized to invest in wage goods rather than capital goods. Portions of the labor force would then move into the capital goods or investment sectors, step up their consumption as they earn more, and thereby generate a multiplier of demand for more wage goods. So, I'll return to Upadhyaya himself. Upadhyaya took to heart Visvesvaraya and Vakil's commentary on Japan, especially the importance of national unity, small industry, and the labor intensity of production. He cited both of their works in his two books that appeared in 1958. The first one called The Two Plans, Promises, Performance, Prospects, and the second called Bharatiya Arthniti Vikas Ki Ek Disha. Over the preceding 2 years of the second five-year plan, India's, from 1956 to 1958, India's balance of payments had swung from a surplus of 38 million US dollars to a deficit of $620 million. Inflation had ticked upwards by about 5 percentage points, and India's foreign reserves had been declining substantially. Bad harvests meant that the quantum of food imports from the United States was rising. The English book attempted to be a rather technical critique of planning and refrained from making any appeals to Indian history or to new culture. By contrast, the Hindi book was both a work of research and a manifesto of sorts offering concrete steps towards what he called Arthniti ka Bharatiyakaran, or the Indianization of economic policy. Although both books suffer from unevenness in clarity and nuance, they display considerable intellectual engagement. Upadhyaya mined government documents for economic statistics and interpreted them carefully. He cited theories of development and the ideas of economists. This is something that the recent bit of interest from Upadhyaya has tended to ignore. Upadhyaya had to reconcile economic ideas to Hindu nationalist thought and tie them to a political agenda. This was not something that he could look to Savarkar or Shyama Prasad Mukherjee's writings for guidance. But it was something, I would suggest, that was conditioned by a target constituency. As previous scholarship has shown, key constituents of the Janasangh were small industrialists, traders, and those in the clerical professions. These two books were part of a wider strategy of attempting to court new groups by appealing to socio-economic issues, including urban workers and company employees, and, as one scholar has described, the rural towns, the provincial professions, small industry, and country trading and banking. Janasangh historian Bruce Graham has called this, quote, a middle world threatened from two directions, by the competitive individualist world of capitalism on the one hand, and by a combination of populism, the militant left, and caste associations on the other, unquote. The content of these texts was distinguishable as Hindu nationalists through their portrayal of an India under threat that needed to become stronger and more unified, by an appeal to Vedic texts, and by a stress on the importance of purification from foreign influence. The English book, The Two Plans, was offered in the spirit of standing united in the face of adversity. Upadhyaya suggested that addressing its economic challenges in a fashion that tied ancient to modern India was a process of India reclaiming itself. Otherwise, India would risk becoming dependent and suffer from a lack of confidence that would destroy the country's soul. A weak country would not be able to face crises. A strong one could find solutions that would convey benefits to all. Upadhyaya stressed the connection between material and ideal in Hindu traditions and suggested compatibility between prosperity and the religious life. He mentioned that Vedic texts listed artha as material prosperity as one of the four purusharthas or objectives of human pursuit. In an environment of abhav or scarcity, stealing became dharma itself. According to Upadhyaya, economic needs had to be provided for before religion and culture could be developed. Look after bhojan before bhajan, he observed. Purifying the economy meant throwing off ideological, institutional, and material influences from abroad. According to Upadhyaya, Indian economic policy was too far beholden to foreign ideas, capital, and methods. He suggested that the particularities of Indian values and history meant that Western models were not applicable, but that Indian intellectuals, often trained in the West, could not think outside that straitjacket. Upadhyaya found Western economic thought to be based on individualism and devoid of social concerns. Literature produced by economists designed for the problems of the developing world and the work of various agencies and committees of the United Nations was not able to rise above narrow self-interest as he saw it. Competition between individuals had given way to competition between classes in the form of Marxism. Neither, according to him, was compatible in a religious and duty-abiding Hindu society. Decentralization and Swadeshi were the twin pillars of Upadhyaya's alternative economy. This was motivated by an understanding that traditionally the Indian economy had been one of artisans, small business people, and farmers. he envisioned that instead of large factories feeding the rise of what he considered disease-ridden and dirty urban centers, electrified villages could provide the motor of a small unit-led industrialization. He used the term Swadeshi, or home manufacturers, not with reference to the Gandhian practice of the hand-spinning of khadi cloth accompanied by the boycott of British goods, but rather as, quote, the fostering of indigenous enterprise, unquote, in service of the objective of securing autonomy for Bharat. Thus, for Upadhyaya, Swadeshi was fully compatible with modern methods of production. The order of priority in Upadhyaya's economy ran as follows: agriculture, industry, trade, and social services. He understood from the Japanese example that prosperous agriculture was, quote, the sine qua non of a developed economy, quote. Upadhyaya suggested that it was particularly ludicrous that farmers had not been consulted in development of the plans, and that the order of plan priorities had to be inverted. He suggested that the country adopt a single land tenure system based on the concept of small owner-based cultivation. This was not unlike Monroe's Rayatwadi system in its ideal, but obviously, being a colonial thinker, he was not going to cite Monroe. In farms where owners were not cultivators, Upadhyaya suggested granting fixity of tenure. To cut the size of large farms, he suggested taxing estates over a ceiling limit at a very high rate. And to free up farm labor from dependency on the landowner, he proposed releasing labor from employment outside the sowing and harvesting times. Considering the middle-class peasant to be the strength of Indian democracy, standing in between the rich and poor and operating as a kind of median idealized voter, he believed in a policy that encouraged their flourishing. This was a way of resisting the more ambitious land reform proposals being threshed out by the Congress Working Committee at the time, such as the brewing Nagpur Resolution, which sought to cap the size of farms and introduce cooperative farming. Rain is the Indian farmer's cardiograph, Upadhyaya observed. India needed to become independent of variations in monsoon rain for farming. But the current methods were destroying farmland and the water supply. Heavy industrialization and the dam building that came with it raised groundwater levels and inundated the fields. Essential ingredients in the soil came up to the surface and turned the land into waste. Drinking water became unhealthy. Further floods were created by diverting the natural course of water and changing the absorptive capacity of the land. Upadhyaya cited examples of floods in the agricultural heartland of North India as examples. By contrast, in small-scale industrialization, various benefits could be realized. They included cost savings, lower import requirements, less flooding of fields, and less wastage of water. Instead of dams, Upadhyaya suggested digging ponds and quadrupling the number of wells in the country from 2.5 million to 10 million. He identified deforestation as a cause of waterlogging and suggested that this process should be proceeded with at a much slower pace. Consistent with the cow protection objectives of Hindu nationalists, he also argued for increasing the content of organic materials, and especially cow dung, in fertilizers. Making more use of the bullock plow was a related recommendation towards this end. Keeping the cow tied to agrarian production processes would ensure that people would continue to value and care for them, and that their numbers would not decline. Upadhyaya's plan for industries mirrored C.N. Vakil's interest in making small industries the backbone of development. He considered large businesses dehumanizing and destructive of individuality. He rejected the principle of economies of scale, central to neoclassical economics that was ascendant in that day and continues to be, and did not believe that the economies of scale reduced production costs. Rather, he suggested that big businesses were more prone to failure, citing a statistic that was not given reference for, that in America, 66% of big businesses failed within the first year. Furthermore, he held that in India, big businesses not only did not produce goods of an international standard, but also came together to block foreign entrance. They therefore had no incentive to increase the quality of goods supplied. In Upadhyaya's scheme, Choti Punjiwale, small capitalists, would take the lead for industrialization. His case for small-scale industrialization reproduced Bucket's argument about wage goods. Upadhyaya advocated for a more labor-intensive process, given India's large population and scarcity of foreign exchange to purchase imported machinery. This did not mean he was against technology and modern machinery, but rather that mechanization and the capital intensity of production dropped from their current levels. This was driven by the feeling that machines put people out of jobs and that strikes by the industrial labor force interfered with the principle of full employment. He believed that the industrial labor force had too much power that was granted by the collective action opportunity that large factories produce. He was sensitive to implications of embracing machinery-intensive large factories that included the loss of jobs for smaller competitors. The role for machinery was thus in the operations of smaller and independent units focused on consumer goods production. Developing these businesses would lead to investable surpluses that could be deployed for capital goods industries. He saw the village as the unit of industrialization and considered small businesses to have possibilities for giving those engaged in agriculture something to do out of season. A crucial step to make these villages suitable for such activity was to provide for their electrification. So, the electrified chote udyog or small industry, as distinct from kutor udyog or household industry, was classified into three categories. The first was self-contained small industries like candle making and locksmithery. The second was industries producing parts for large business concerns, producing such outputs as electrical goods or bicycles. And the third was small industries in direct competition with bigger industries. It was the second type of chote udyog that Upadhyaya believed the country should prioritize to work in tandem with bigger industries. There were two ways to do this. Either the country could make capital goods in big businesses and consumer goods in small ones, or small industries could produce components that would be assembled to make final products in bigger ones. For guidance on the latter category, Upadhyaya again turned to Japan. He cited the Japanese rail coach, shipbuilding, and motor manufacturing industries, and especially singled out the adoption of scientific principles of management in the country as crucial to the success of these enterprises. Villages should be linked along cooperative lines for marketing and distribution of goods, and laborers should be given shares of ownership in companies. Upadhyaya conceded that one day heavy industries would be desirable, but suggested that for the time being India did not have the resources to make them. Having outlined an alternative method of production, Upadhyaya turned to the circulation and movement of goods. Quote, before India starts searching for markets abroad, it needs to develop its large internal market, unquote, he wrote. He believed that by converting India's own raw materials into finished products and consuming them at home, India was becoming, quote, a strong state. Trade was to take place inside India's borders, along India's roads, and across inland waterways. To improve such trade, investment in roads and waterways was needed. These were more important than the railways, he reckoned, in bringing about decentralized development. The problem with railways, he believed, was that they were close to capacity in terms of the freights that they could handle. Therefore, the investment emphasis should shift to expanding cheaper and older modes of transportation. Furthermore, they were an imposition of the Raj, which he found to be deleterious. According to Upadhyaya, the infrastructure for internal trade should be financed by the government. However, government should not interfere in exchange. So, defending petty traders as Madhyam Vargiya Vyakti or middle-class people, he argued that the state should not encroach upon their traditional ways of life. The government's recent proposals to create a straight trading corporation and nationalize the corn trade would lead to great inefficiency, he reckoned. Here he was catering to his base of traders and showed an implicit belief that corruption and inefficiency by the government was more likely than hoarding by traders. Making the village the site of development and substituting large factories with smaller units of production would allow India to avoid subjecting its citizens to the dislocations he associated with cities. By spreading out production and linking areas through better transportation, Upadhyaya believed India could avoid urbanization, which he did not consider an indicator of development. In a country like India with a warm climate, the excess clustering of population could give rise to slums and the easy spread of diseases. Furthermore, migration to cities and for employment in large industries, quote, uproot the labor from his family, caste, and village community, and place him in a new, work-oriented milieu without any human values. In this milieu, the human is just a laborer. With all his values destroyed, the human succumbs to these adverse circumstances. Finally, migration to urban areas drained rural areas of talent. The final priority for Upadhyaya was social welfare. He offered a program that aimed to utilize existing resources well and eschewed grand schemes. He suggested the widespread adoption of easily available and cheap medicine and placed particular emphasis on Ayurveda. Primary education was to be conducted through Samaj Seva, social service, whereby the educated unemployed would give their time to youth and offer them educational services. To provide shelter, the government should start a project to build homes with cheap building materials. And to alleviate unemployment, the government should employ people for infrastructure instead of machinery wherever possible. It's not clear how Upadhyaya envisioned implementing this program, but he considered it to be quite pragmatic. Upadhyaya's ideal economy was one of peasant proprietors and small industries. They were to be linked via a network of roads and inland waterways. This would help the country develop a thriving internal market insulated from the vicissitudes of the international economy. Decentralizing production would arrest the clumping of population in urban centers and the resulting problems of slum dwelling and disease transmission. As in the case of Vakil and Visvesvaraya before him, Upadhyaya believed that the Japanese management of industrialization would have the most resonance for India. This was clearly not a free market economy, even if it did envision a smaller role for government-owned public enterprises. State policy was essential at every step of the way in ensuring that the desired economy could come into being. Curiously, Upadhyaya's writings omit any discussion of money, credit, and finance. Austerity and expenditure of foreign exchange seems to be the only real thought he offers on these issues. The reader is left wondering how to finance the infrastructure schemes he proposes. It is equally unclear how would-be entrepreneurs might start their businesses unless they already have the finances to do so. Rural credit creation, upon which his scheme would need to rely, gets no mention at all. Although it would be difficult to speculate why, at this point it's important to bear in mind that Upadhyaya was largely a self-educated economic thinker. Theorizing an alternative economic policy was an activity that he came to later on in life. It was not his primary concern. Another major tension in Upadhyaya's analysis sprung from the entrance of Hindu nationalism into electoral politics in the form of the Janasangh. Upadhyaya grappled with reconciling the legacy of the RSS, which seeks primarily to remold Indian society free of the constraints of the state, with the Janasangh's attempt to capture state power through participation in electoral politics. His books attacked the intended centralization of government power under the Congress, while they spoke of the Janasangh's desire to have the central government intervene in various areas of the economy. This is all the more complex because in the two plans, he suggested abolishing state governments entirely, while decentralizing the economy. The Janasangh proposed replacing states with 100 largely self-governed Janapadas, a name that referred to territorial units in ancient kingdoms. Operating in both English and Hindi public spheres, Deendayal Upadhaya permanently widened the ambit of the Hindutva political project. He brought the techno-scientific exercise of planning squarely into the domain of politics from which Nehru had sought to isolate it, and questioned its alleged rationality by offering an alternative development ideology. He contested the exaltation of models, theories, and technocrats trained in the West by offering a critique of planning and an alternative policy echoing earlier generations of Indian thinkers, and informed by the most successful industrialization that had hitherto taken place in the non-Western world. Upadhyaya accepted India as it was, an agrarian economy. He envisioned the peasant proprietor as the figure behind the economy and sought to build communities around the linkage of these figures together. Transitioning to industrial production would be led by small industries and gradual drift away from agrarian production, but only after it produced enough food. To purify the Indian economy from foreign influence meant to decentralize it and put emphasis on the small scale and the labor intensive. So we sort of move to the third part of the talk, Upadhyaya after Upadhyaya. The nexus between Hindu nationalism and economic policy created by Upadhyaya existed well into the 1980s. I won't go into too many of the details, but it's clear from subsequent Janasangh manifestos and party resolutions on economic affairs that its platform turned increasingly to one of economic protest, and Craig Baxter has outlined this in his book. Upadhyaya's books were helpful in articulating the dimensions of the spirit. Party resolutions on economic affairs included suggestions for a single integrated tax scheme. They suggested decentralization of industry, promotion of Swadeshi enterprises, and labor intensity in production processes. Even after the Janasangh was dissolved, this trend continued in the BJP's party literature. Its 1984 election manifesto, written by Vajpayee, promised legislation that guaranteed employment to its citizens to, quote, foster the Swadeshi spirit, unquote, and offer more credit to small-scale industries such as agro-industries and producers of other kinds of consumer goods. The proposed industrial policy listed principles of self-reliance and decentralization as priorities. It promised to keep multinationals out of consumer industries and to make workers shareholders in the companies where they worked. The manifesto declared the party's approach to life in society was, quote, as expounded by our late Deendayal Upadhaya. Later, apart from the National Front coalition of left parties, the BJP was the only party opposed to the 1991-1992 budget that Manmohan Singh produced. 4 years later, in 1995, the left and the BJP once again formed an unlikely alliance and stalled the second wave of economic liberalization initiatives to be released by that government, citing excessive potential for influence on the economy and in particular in the power sector. However, when the BJP came to power in a coalition government in 1998, the party abandoned its focus on small industry-based and decentralized economy autonomous from foreign influence. The precarious finances of the government of India and the inability of the internal market to generate adequate economic growth led the BJP to build upon the liberalization reforms of the previous governments. Measures implemented included eliminating a range of subsidies that included fertilizer, the privatization of various public sector enterprises, and the dereservation of items for production by the small-scale sector. It seemed that after 40 years, the principles of economic policy Upadhyaya had devised for Hindu nationalism were being discarded in practice. But since 2014, as one committed BJP party member and former editor of the affiliated organizer newspaper has noted, quote, Deendayal Upadhaya has become the political brand equity for the BJP that Gandhi was for the Congress party, unquote. The 100th birth anniversary in 2016, according to this writer, was, quote, an occasion to recast, to reinvent the canvas on which the BJP ideological format was designed, unquote. The author mentioned that, quote, already dozens of welfare projects named after him are running in states ruled by the BJP, and that the NDA has launched some schemes and more around the ambit. Among these are the signature rural electrification scheme that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the Gram Jyoti Yojana. At one level, this claim is spurious. Why has the embrace of Upadhyaya's ideas ignored his biggest policy suggestion, which was to prioritize agriculture? The protests of late 2018 attest to government's consistent sidelining of the interests of the agrarian economy that continues to employ half of India's population. But at another level, the claim is perhaps not so crazy. Consider three measures. There are more, but I leave you with these. First, the National Waterways Act of 2016 and the Jal Marg Vikas project of over 5,600 crores. This has resulted in the first inland voyage by a container ship in 70 years. It was a PepsiCo container ship called the SS or MS Rabindranath Tagore. Second, that was just for Islam. Second, the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, a central scheme providing funds for states to connect villages to all-weather roads, has laid out thousands of kilometers of roads for the country. And finally, there is the historic joining of the railway budget to the general budget in 2017. Otherwise, the budgets were done separately. This was justified because of its steadily decreasing claim on government budgetary funds. Not as a percentage of, in absolute, this is a percentage of the government budget, not in absolute terms. Absolute terms, the railway budget keeps increasing, employs 20,000 people. So, it seems that there are domains in which Upadhyaya's ideas can be safely appropriated and others in which they might be ignored. The brave new world of post-liberalization India has introduced problems to the BJP that Upadhyaya could not foresee. The BJP now draws support from classes of people employed in the service sector tied to multinational corporations. India has recently approved 100% foreign direct investment in sectors like retail and aviation. And the country has climbed the ease of doing business rankings published by the World Bank from 142 to 77. But those who espouse Swadeshi and the domestic small industries vision of development, like the RSS-affiliated Swadeshi Jagran Manch, or Swadeshi Awakening Forum, consider such policy measures to be a threat to the country. The Manch quite consciously identifies itself with Deendayal Upadhaya, and in fact, one of its leaders even brought out a book called Economic Philosophy of Deendayal Upadhaya. The Manch has attacked Walmart's acquisition of a 77% stake in Flipkart, claiming that it was a foreign retailer. The small dealers in Flipkart's supply chain now face pressure to accept lower margins or be replaced by more cost-effective alternatives. How the BJP will reconcile these imperatives to integrate India further into the world economy whilst promoting small regional businesses competing with multinational counterparts is not clear. But I suspect the tug of war between these interest groups constituting its basis of support will continue. And as it does, we may hear more fact and fiction about Deendayal Upadhyaya, the economic thinker. Thank you.
I understand that on one hand there is a constant glorification of Deendayal Upadhyaya. On the other hand, one can see that there is a move from his economic policy of small-scale industry, agriculture, and a conscious move from world economy, whereas India currently now is very much integrated into world economy and quoting big capital. So how do you explain these two contradictory tendencies?
Right. So,
do we take a few more questions?
I was just wondering, in the context of the 1950s, the kind of reconstruction of the Japanese industrialization experience after World War II, they were a defeated nation. And Zaibatsu, which was a key feature of post-Meiji industrialization, huge financial industrial conglomerates that controlled vast swathes of the national economy were being disbanded because they seemed to contribute to the militarist kind of culture. So does that influence political choices? I mean, like the Soviet Union was a victorious nation. They defeated Nazism, right? The horrors of collectivization not widely spoken about those days. And Japan was a defeated nation, and Zaibatsu, which I don't see listed among the three factors you identify as key to the Japanese industrialization process, is not are being disbanded. So replicating that model in India would be much more complex than just emulating these three features of Japanese experience. You would have to also create that kind of last conglomerate that could bring domestic capital under some form of discipline, under some form of control, which I think our capitalist class were not quite prepared for. They were not prepared to submit to that form of control. And the second question is that you mentioned Vajpayee, but Vajpayee was the most prominent parliamentarian of the Jansangh during Upadhyaya's presidential tenure. In the 1950s, he was seen by the US as an alternative kind of, a spokesman for an alternative economic paradigm, more kind of favorable towards a private enterprise kind of economy. I think works by Walter Anderson and so on identify him as that he was taking the US on some scholarship scheme and so on and so forth. And he was seen to be mouthing Hindu nationalist platitudes, but essentially a pragmatist who would kind of favor a free enterprise model of the economy. But curiously, when he succeeded Upadhyaya as president, and he presided over the resurrection of the party as the BJP, he adopted a Gandhian socialism platform, right? So I'm just wondering, you say that Upadhyaya's Swadeshi had nothing in common with Gandhian Swadeshi, but does this cycle of history, the wheel come one circle there, suggest that there was probably more in common between the two? And when you identify.
So we'll take these two questions first and then we can do
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Those are both excellent questions. I mean, so I would say that I think you're exactly right, which is that you do have these sort of competing impulses, right? And I think that the economy is a large beast, and there are many different spheres in which you can operate, right? And I think I would interpret in some sense the last 5 years as a kind of incomplete process of trying to reconcile these tendencies, right? And future permutations and combinations of how they will work. So on the one hand, you have these roads and waterways and rural electrification, but on the other hand, you have this coding of direct investment that's limited. So these are measures that are trying to appease different constituencies that constitute the base of support, right? And so where you have Upadhyaya sort of uncontroversially is sort of as an icon or as somebody who sort of figurehead for a philosophy, right? And so, but what I'm trying to indicate is that rather than having some kind of broad embrace of free market paradigms, right? What you have is a very powerful tug in a different direction, right? And that it is essentially these sort of tug of war, as I'm calling it, that is determining the trajectories or helping to determine the trajectory. So, thank you for your questions. Yeah, so on the Zaibatsu, so I was primarily referring to 1868 to 1919, right? So my understanding is the Zaibatsu come in more in 20s and 30s, right?
Yeah.
So
the 1860s.
right, and when no, sure. And then they are essentially coordinating or aggregating the stuff that's being done elsewhere. So yeah, you're absolutely right to say that this is something that in these particular figures they are not looking at very closely, right? Which I think is surprising, and which probably, as I revise this paper, is something to address. Why aren't they thinking about Zaibatsu? What is the distinct? I think there is an inimical, feeling towards big business that someone like Upadhyaya has.
Inimical feeling.
Yes. And given the milieu that he's hailing from and the kinds of things that are interesting, that scholars like Lechuber and others have given, that essentially these Indian capitalists come together, block anything, provide you with substandard goods, and they block the competition, right? And they essentially extract rent from the competition, right? So that's sort of one thing. And yeah, I think there are immense. So the way that I'm sort of thinking of Japan is, I don't think that it's so much Japan as something that India is to follow piece by piece, but rather Japan as something that's sort of in the head as you are trying to move towards what India should go.
The fact that they were a defeated nation didn't.
Yeah, so this defeated nation issue, I think, is something that, yes, it is a defeated nation, no doubt, right? But it is a defeated nation who, by this time that he's writing, is coming up again. Right? And it's a defeated nation that did win before they, were, vanquished Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They had their own form of colonial rule, that they won their 3 wars and defeated Russia and all that. Right? So it's seen within a broader kind of context. And then, with respect to Vajpayee, I think that's a really interesting question. Yeah, so I would actually say that in the 60s, the US is actually more interested in the Swathantra Party than in Vajpayee, right? Because Swathantra Party in the 67 election, when these guys get 35 seats, these guys get 46 seats, right? They form the coalition government in Orissa. They are chief opposition in Gujarat, they are chief opposition in Rajasthan, right? And they have got a big nationalist leader as their brand equity, so to speak, C. Rajgopal, right? And Minu Masani wears English suits, right? He's hanging around with Willy Brandt, he's traveling the world, right? So somebody who's taking money from the CIA for his Congress of Cultural Freedom, right? So there is sort of that this thing as well. I think Vajpayee, you're right. Vajpayee, in my understanding, Vajpayee does not, until much later in the game, when he sort of becomes prime minister, doesn't have a very concrete economic policy. And in 1984, when he brings out Gandhian socialism, it is because of the essentially, because he's basically trying to reinvent the party, and he finds that, appealing to Gandhi is something that will do you some favors, right? Particularly within the context that by 1984-85, Rajiv Gandhi is slowly starting to bring about internal liberalization of the Indian economy, right? So Gandhi can be seen as a counterpoint. But yes, there is an unacknowledged tension, which is that if you're going to push for Gandhian socialism and say that your credo is defined entirely by Deendayal Upadhaya, this is somebody who rejected, he thought that khadi spinning and whatnot was essentially retrograde. So I think that is a tension. And it's not clear to me that he sought to navigate that in any or maybe his own understanding of it was nebulous. But yeah, so
Yeah. Internationalism seems to have something for the vanquished. And also Mussolini's Italy.
yes.
I'm thinking about it.
Yeah,
There is
now after
a
it-
fascination for.
Only when he was on top.
Masi. Yes.
So, as you pointed out, Chipper's argument and others, that actually Swadeshi was probably code for getting close to the Bombay industrialists. Because Swadeshi meant you were basically reassuring them that if we come, we will not open up the country, we are not the opposite of the Congress, we will continue to maintain your interests, possibly. But my question was more towards, despite all the talk of Upadhyaya, and to be honest, Upadhyaya is a remarkable person, because if you say that he's completely self-educated in economics, some of his ideas are very good, some of them are, of course, stupid, but a large number of ideas are very good, and he's rightly looking at Japan actually as a model. One wonders why more of it is not being done, despite the advice that Milton Friedman gave. But my question is, you say that we can see some elements, we sure can see some elements of that. But I think Vajpayee did not care that much, because if you see the Vajpayee era, it includes a lot of measures which actually go against the Deendayal Upadhyaya's recommendation. I'm especially curious about one thing that you mentioned, that Vajpayee government reduced the restrictions on small-scale enterprise, relaxed some of the curbing. So you mentioned what those were, and in terms of Modi seems to quite openly be a fan of Upadhyaya. Maybe Vajpayee saw him more as a rival than an acolyte. So Modi, of course, is only lip service, but I'm wondering, what were those measures that
Dereservation, small scale.
Yeah, it was dereservation. I don't remember the sector, but there were certain sectors that were reserved for small scale industry that are now he has opened up to everybody. That's the
Vajpayee had his major point of friction with the party over insurance, foreign investment in insurance. The party almost kind of revolted him. He had to resign and then.
No, but Vajpayee's era is actually the one era in which you see a lot of privatization happening through Shori. This could not have happened without Vajpayee's support. I mean, even though people credit Shori with it could not have happened without without Vajpayee's support. So my question is, then they are clearly not following, Deendayal Upadhyaya in those things, So what's going on? I mean, Modi is actually quite opposed to those kind of things. So far, Modi has not privatized anything.
Yes. Any other questions? Yes. Anish. Sorry, there is a student here. Yes, please.
Like the question is a little out of context from the research, but I wanted to ask, so if we see how liberal and open economies like America or in Europe, their social and political structure is also very liberal, and they believe individual liberty, and they follow very liberal form of government and democracy. But what do you think Deendayal Upadhyaya's economic thought, how will it affect the social and political structure in a country? Because India is so mixed and it is so varied over the years. We have had different social and political structures we have followed over the last 70 years. So if we just followed Deendayal Upadhyaya's ideology, where would we be now?
Yeah. Anish.
Yeah. Thanks, Anita. That was really very informative and really interesting work. I also had a bunch of questions about the Japanese thing, but I think we've covered that part of the discussion. I was actually curious about a couple of things, a couple of subpoints. So first, this question of agro greater than industry, greater than trade, greater than social welfare. That is to say, the economy should be understood in these terms. I'm wondering whether a more robust cognitive reading of this is not necessary. And let me just outline what I mean in a couple of ways, which is that if what he is imagining is a small peasant economy, or any kind of economy that's centered on agriculture, there are two concrete models that are already around in political debate at that point of time. One eventually becomes the Green Revolution, kind of more capitalistic inputs and the development of this thing. The other becomes what the left follows in Bengal when it comes to power, but of course has been asking for a long time, which is serious land reform, right? Which becomes the program of creating the small peasant proprietor explicitly on the grounds that it will increase productivity, among other things. It will serve social justice and increase productivity. And they're drawing, in a sense, from this entire history, including the Japanese history, of serious land reform. His opposition to land reform in that sense seems to me to be a kind of act of bad faith in a certain sense with respect to this. But there's another more interesting angle, I think, even to this same thing, and that's the other branch of this, which is if their base is the small trader and this thing, what you talked about in terms of the absence of discussion of credit is even more boggling. Because in fact, already during colonial India, especially in the late colonial period, this has been a tension that the colonial state has been keen to contain, which is money lenders, small traders grabbing land. In Punjab, elsewhere, they've been keen to stop these kinds of processes happening and to protect sort of peasant agriculture. In a certain sense, his ignoring of this question of credit is strategic, and really, again, I think lends itself to a bad faith placement of agriculture as the cornerstone of this thing, especially if, and I'm not aware, if he's not talking about these kinds of protective measures against corrosive economic lending by because they are literally the same sets of people. The traders are the money lenders and this sort of thing. So, on that question of land, I think there's and agriculture, is there a more combative reading that's necessary in a certain sense of Deendayal Upadhyaya's own understanding of this? The second thing that I'm curious about is why, or what I'd like to hear maybe, is the relationship of funding to the party through some of these kinds of ideas. What you're pointing out is how significant he is for building up a base for the Jansangh, literally creating it from scratch in UP and other places. In fact, one of the rumors around his death is that he wanted to bring the headquarters to North India, and so he was bumped off within the southern circles and this kind of thing. But really, this question of funding and its support base, especially around funding, because again, I think you can read Adani and their presence in Modi's this thing and the corporate presence as very much indicating the push and pull that we're talking about, and for the BJP in '98 and so on. So I'm curious about whether there's a reading to be done there, a very crude one, but I think perhaps a useful one. And then third question is about why does there seem to be so